This biography is scheduled to appear next year. Mr. Reich spoke at Barnes & Noble booksellers in New York City.
Okay, good evening. I welcome you to a little brief evening with Nelson Rockefeller. Just want to tell you a little story about signings, this book in particular. I was signing at another bookstore, which shall be nameless, but it was a very prominent bookstore in Manhattan. And when you sign a book, they put autographed copy on the front on a label. And a friend of mine a few days later went by to the bookstore and bought 3 of these autographed copies. And the fellow was watching her buy this and said, "Is it true that Nelson Rockefeller signed those books?" So obviously they really, many people in New York still believe he's a living presence. This book is about the first 50 years of Nelson Rockefeller's life. And it ends with his election as governor in 1958. And what I thought I'd read tonight is a little bit about him positioning himself for his first political campaign. He had held office, public office, in the Roosevelt administration, the Truman administration, the Eisenhower administration, but he'd never actually been elected to anything until he ran for governor against Averell Harriman in 1958. And what I begin to do in the book is to explain the obstacles that were in his path. The fact that it was not an automatic, a given that Nelson Rockefeller would be elected governor. And this part deals with, starts with his meeting or the approaches to Tom Dewey, who was the former Republican governor of New York. One day in 1956, Dewey lunched with David Rockefeller at the Chase Bank. When the talk turned to Nelson's political aspirations, the former governor was openly scornful. He made the flat statement, David recalled, that clearly no member of our family could ever be elected to office because of the family name. Undaunted by David's experience, Nelson decided to seek out Dewey himself. There are varying accounts of this meeting. According to one, Dewey condescendingly suggested to Rockefeller that a slow slog was in order. If Nelson was really interested in politics, Dewey could arrange to have him appointed New York postmaster, after which he might be able to run for Congress. And then later, maybe then you could run for governor. Rockefeller's own account of Dewey's reaction was a bit more colorful. He slapped my knee and laughed out loud and said, "Nelson, you're a great guy, but you couldn't get elected dog catcher in New York." Fueling Dewey's skepticism was his certitude that the GOP, long castigated as the party of the rich, could not win with a Rockefeller as its nominee. As the governor's aide and law partner, Burdell Bixby, explains, there was a feeling among Republicans in New York that nobody who had as much money as Herbert Lehman could be elected on the Republican ticket. It was Dewey's view that only if Rockefeller earned his spurs at a lower level would he have any sort of a shot at the governorship. Says Bixby, Dewey properly felt he had been elected governor because he had established himself as a heroic prosecutor of bad guys. He was not elected because he was a Republican, but because of his record as prosecutor. With his name, not his record, as his political capital, Nelson Rockefeller didn't, in Tom Dewey's opinion, stand a chance. There was, of course, one way around this conundrum, and that was to become a Democrat. There was much to be said for a party switch. Wealth did not seem to pose the same problems for New York Democrats as it did for Republicans, as evidenced by the elections of FDR, Lehman, and Harriman. Furthermore, most of Rockefeller's friends and advisors, Frank Jameson, Wally Harrison, Adolph Burley, Anna Rosenberg, Oscar Riebhausen, were Democrats. Rockefeller once walked into a meeting in room 5600, looked around the room, and chuckled. "My goodness," he said, "do you realize I'm the only Republican here?" Pat Weaver remembers bringing up the possibility with Rockefeller in 1957, when Rockefeller was pondering his political future. I told him, "Nelson, there's one thing you should face right away. You should do just exactly what all the other guys in your position have always done. Lehman, Franklin Roosevelt, Harriman. You should turn your back on your people, become a Democrat, and embrace the masses." Rockefeller, however, didn't even want to discuss it. "Forget it," he snapped at Weaver. "Forget it." To those who pressed him on the point, Rockefeller would speak about his family's deep Republican roots, not only on the Rockefeller side, but on the Aldrich side as well. Turning his back on this tradition was, for him, simply unthinkable. And there was another reason for his resistance, which he spoke about years later to one of his gubernatorial aides, Harry Albright. They were having lunch at Rockefeller's 54th Street hideaway when Albright noticed on a table a small photograph of FDR. "What a guy," said Rockefeller, practically genuflecting at the photo. And he proceeded to reminisce about Roosevelt's periodic attempts to cajole Rockefeller into changing parties. The reason he never succumbed, he said, was a matter of philosophy. "I used to play tennis at Foxhall Road with Henry Wallace and Rexford Tugwell," Rockefeller said, "and I was always uncomfortable with their very leftish views. The way I saw it, if I became a Democrat, I'd always be in the position of holding the party back, whereas if I stayed a Republican, I'd be pushing the party forward. And pushing forward was a position far more suited to his temperament. And so, for better or worse, Rockefeller would stake his future on the Republican Party, pushing forward, not pulling back." He pondered Dewey's words and the words of Frank Jameson, his public relations advisor, and took into account all the family misgivings. He hesitated, but not for long. This time, at least, Rockefeller let his hunger and impetuousness rule the day. He would not be New York postmaster. He would not change parties. He would not worry about the family complications. He wasn't rushing into the race, but he was determined to start laying the groundwork for it. He would aim for 1958, and he would aim for Harriman's chair. The time of watchful waiting, of biding his time, was over. His philosophy, his brother Lawrence had said, was, well, let's start, and 9 times out of 10 you'll find a way. Shrugging off all the perceived drawbacks and impediments, Rockefeller took his first considered steps toward the candidacy. And what he did first was, as I point out, lead a crusade to keep the Brooklyn Dodgers in Brooklyn. That was his first attempt to make himself a public figure in New York in his own right. For the proud citizens of Brooklyn, indeed for all New Yorkers, a tragedy had been unfolding that summer of 1957 in Ebbets Field. A tragedy played out not on the field, but in the corporate office of Dodger owner Walter O'Malley. Tired of the meager financial returns offered by that bandbox of a ballpark, the cheroot-chomping O'Malley was entertaining a lucrative offer by the city fathers of Los Angeles to move the club out west. Coming on the heels of the Giants' decision to desert the Polo Grounds and relocate to San Francisco, the Dodgers' exodus would deal a devastating blow to the city's spirit. Yet New York officials seemed totally unable to structure a counteroffer that might change O'Malley's mind. Truly a deus ex machina was needed if Brooklyn was to have any hope of holding on to its team. Enter Nelson Rockefeller. The unexpected move was Frank Jameson's idea. Having failed to dissuade Rockefeller from a gubernatorial bid, Jameson, consummate pro that he was now doing everything in his power to advance his chief's political fortunes. With his usual shrewdness, he perceived the Dodger situation as an ideal means to catapult Rockefeller front and center in the public consciousness. Rockefeller's intervention would be seen as a great public-spirited gesture, of a piece with his maneuvers a decade earlier to keep the United Nations in New York. "You don't have to buy the team," he assured Rockefeller. "You just have to make a bid to show your interest." Yet if Jameson had searched for 100 years, he couldn't have come up with a cause less likely to fire up Rockefeller's enthusiasm. Rockefeller had absolutely no interest in spectator sports, including the national pastime. His utter ignorance of a game that so preoccupied his fellow Americans was a constant source of wonderment to his subordinates. On the infrequent occasions when Louise Boyer, his personal assistant, who was herself a great fan, actually persuaded him to attend a Yankee World Series game, he had to be coached in advance on when to cheer. At the ballpark, his boredom and bewilderment were transparent. He didn't like it a bit, says John Lockwood, his counsel, and he'd get on television looking like a sour apple. Jameson would tell him, "God damn it, don't go if you can't look like you're having fun." Nevertheless, even as benighted a soul as Nelson Rockefeller could see the surefire promotional possibilities of the Dodger affair, he met with O'Malley and Baseball Commissioner Ford Frick, and then issued a statement proclaiming his interest in the matter. "I share the feeling of so many New Yorkers that every effort should be made to keep National League Baseball in New York. Certainly the greatest city in the world should have 2 baseball teams. It has proved that it can support them." Noting that the big stumbling block seemed to be O'Malley's demand for a new 50,000-seat stadium in downtown Brooklyn, Rockefeller and his aides crafted a plan whereby Rockefeller would offer some package of financial aid to move the stadium along. Then he and his entourage went down to City Hall to present Mayor Wagner with the proposal. Nelson was going to have a car take us down, remembers his public relations assistant Kirk Burbank, but Frank said, "No, you're going on the subway." And he went. Not having ventured much underground, Rockefeller was positively dazzled by the trip. "Hey, these subways are neat," he exclaimed. "I don't know why people complain about them." Of course, relates Burbank, this was about 10:30 in the morning, when it was all deserted and clean. On another later occasion, when he happened onto the subway, Rockefeller was equally impressed by the conditions. "Does every car have a restroom?" he asked, not realizing that the little nook he was pointing to was the conductor's cab. Wagner was receptive to Rockefeller's ideas, and the two went on to offer the plan to O'Malley. Oscar Riebhausen remembers the meeting at the mayor's residence, Gracie Mansion, and the pungent aroma of O'Malley's big fat cigar as he listened to Rockefeller's pitch. Afterward, O'Malley told reporters that the proposal has merit and that he would defer any final decision on the move until Wagner had a chance to meet with the city's Board of Estimate. Riebhausen, for one, saw through the Dodger owner's posturing. All Walter was doing after we offered him this or that was turn around and call the mayor of Los Angeles and say, "They're offering me such and such and such and such. What can you do?" But Rockefeller was not nearly so skeptical. Caught up now in the chase, thrilled by the headlines it was engendering, he believed he had a real shot at bringing O'Malley around. "Nelson is like a little boy with a baseball thing," Nancy Hanks related to her parents. Really excited. So engrossed was Rockefeller that when he heard about Los Angeles' counteroffer, he began furiously making plans to up his bid, until an alarmed Frank Jameson stepped in. By this point, recalls Burbank, Frank was saying to him, "Let it go. You don't really want it." Reluctantly, Rockefeller finally gave up. Unable to meet O'Malley's escalating demands, the city of New York sadly bade goodbye to the Brooklyn Dodgers. Just as Jameson had anticipated, Brooklyn's loss turned out to be Nelson Rockefeller's gain. Although packaged as a gesture of civic pride, everyone around him knew what his headline-grabbing bid suggested. On his first visit to Washington after the Dodger affair, staffers at the reorganization committee that he chaired greeted him with, "Hello, Governor." Day after day, New York newspapers had breathlessly chronicled the saga of Rockefeller's 11th-hour mission. The capstone was the Times' profile of him on September 11th as its man in the news. Rather than ascribe his effort to political aspirations, the Times bought the party line put out by Room 5600. That was Rockefeller's United Nations mood coming to the fore, a reference to his role in keeping the UN in New York. It quoted the Rockefeller friend, "Whenever the community of New York begins to lose something, the family gets interested." He was described in that profile as a resolute, aggressive, and boundlessly energetic man of 49 who enjoys rare gifts of salesmanship. He is bursting with an optimism that can find an outlet only in action. The Nelson Rockefeller who was girding himself at 49 for his first political campaign seemed indeed barely different than Nelson Rockefeller at 39 or 29. He was 4 times a grandfather now, but the typical ravages of middle age barely grazed him. His face was virtually unlined, his hair full and brown, his 5'9", or 5'10", no one was quite sure which was right, physique as trim as a young midshipman's. The only tip-off that he was verging on 50 was the reading glasses, which he was still not enough of a politician to abjure in his public appearances. His adrenal level was as astounding as ever. The array of his activities a kaleidoscopic whirl that would have left most mortals reeling. For starters, he was still fully immersed at the moment in the Special Studies Project, the first report of which he had still not appeared. He chaired the State Constitutional Convention Subcommission. He headed the President's Reorganization Committee and was in the midst of a study at Eisenhower's behest of the foreign policy apparatus, a study that contemplated possibly kicking John Foster Dulles upstairs to a senior advisory role. Soon, in the wake of Sputnik, he would start studying as well a possible Defense Department reorganization. He had just opened his Museum of Primitive Art on 54th Street. He was overseeing the new Dartmouth Art Center. He continued as chairman of the Museum of Modern Art, of Rockefeller Center, and of IBEC. And somehow he also found plenty of time to travel, to Africa, to Iran, to Korea. So sprawling were his activities now, and so copious the staff needed to attend to them, that Rockefeller found his existing offices inadequate to accommodate it all. In 1956, he had acquired the 2 townhouses on West 55th Street that backed into the twins he already owned on West 54th Street, with an eye toward future expansion of his primitive art museum. But it wasn't long before the Beaux-Arts structures were crammed not with Congolese artifacts, but with the desks of Rockefeller staff members. In the shadow of his father's great monument, Rockefeller Center, a mini Nelson Rockefeller complex was taking shape. There were those who wondered how Rockefeller kept up this frenetic pace, how he raced from meeting to meeting and project to project without ever slackening or falling ill. Part of the explanation was simply glandular. One wag called him the male equivalent of Eleanor Roosevelt. Then, too, he had the cushion of his energetic and talented staff. With the equanimity of the super-rich, He could sail serenely through a day that left Kissinger or Nancy Hanks frazzled and overwhelmed. But there was another answer as to how he did it, an answer that August Heckscher stumbled upon when he was working on the Special Studies Project. Heckscher, the director of the 20th Century Fund, had been asked to rewrite the Foreign Policy Report. With no other office available and Rockefeller away, Nancy Hanks told him he could use Rockefeller's. One day, in search of a paperclip, Heckscher happened to open the desk drawer. And there, to his astonishment, he encountered hundreds of little boxes and bottles of pills. Says Heckscher, it was enough to suggest to me that a man who seemed so well-balanced and happy was really under enormous strain and stress. This was Rockefeller's private little treasure trove, the cornucopia of pills that he stuffed into his desk drawer and carried in a satchel wherever he went. What he did with them all and where he obtained them was always a mystery, but he was more than willing to share his stash with anyone with a complaint. He was always taking pills, remembers his Washington aide Bill Kintner, and he was always giving them out, too. When Nancy Hanks was tired, Rockefeller slipped her vitamin pills. When Rod Perkins in the HEW days was bedridden with the flu, Rockefeller arrived at his house with his bag of pills and, says Perkins, insisted to my wife that she administer some of these to me. Perkins thought they were penicillin, but he never knew for sure. Most of the time, Rockefeller's eager ministrations were appreciated, but not always. During a trip to Africa, he was visiting with the fabled missionary Dr. Albert Schweitzer. Just before joining the good doctor for lunch, Rockefeller decided to offer the natives some medical help of his own and stood outside Schweitzer's ward handing out sulfacetamide, an anti-dysentery drug. When Schweitzer came along, he was appalled. "It is not necessary here," he berated Rockefeller in French. "I was terribly embarrassed," Rockefeller would confess when he told the story later. Schweitzer, imagine. There were plenty of antibiotics in Rockefeller's pill collection, and painkillers, and vitamins, and medications for his troublesome sinuses, what Locke would refer to as liquid dynamite for the nose. And there were also a goodly number of tranquilizers. Rockefeller freely admitted taking them. In fact, in one interview, he waxed enthusiastic to a sympathetic reporter about the whole Milltown field. Tranquilizers, he said, had helped him over many tense moments. His Milltown habit was one indication of the inner tension that coiled like an overwound watch spring beneath the surface. Another was the continued omnipresence of his favorite osteopath, Kenneth Ryland. So frequently did Rockefeller need Ryland's services that he set up an office for him just downstairs from room 5600. Given the velocity of Rockefeller's life, there was abundant cause for the strain and for the assuagement he sought from Milltown's and the osteopath's table. But far and away the chief cause in the fall of 1957, as he prepared for the electoral test to come, was his marriage to Todd. Since the war, their relationship had come to more and more resemble the frigid marriage of Charles Foster Kane and his society wife and Citizen Kane, one marked by ever-widening distances, physically and emotionally, between the partners. During Rockefeller's stint in Washington under Eisenhower, with Todd declining to join him in the Capitol, they had seen little of one another, leaving Rockefeller free to indulge in what amounted to a double life with a new young consort, Nancy Hanks. With Hanks, he behaved like a footloose young swain, sharing dinners at Foxhall Road in her apartment, visiting her family's North Carolina homestead, lavishing her with gifts. In general, acting as though his marriage to Todd did not exist. Todd's intimates have little doubt that she was aware of her husband's peregrinations. But, in the manner of many an upper-class doyenne, she seemed willing to overlook his wayward ways in the interest of home and hearth, the children and grandchildren. Not much changed upon his return to New York in 1956. The breach between Nelson and Todd was, by then, an irreparable fact of life. Not long afterward, a young Norwegian housemaid, Anne-Marie Rasmussen, came to work for the Rockefellers and quickly noticed something odd about their domestic arrangements at Pocantico. While Mr. Rockefeller would spend considerable time with his family at their colonial house, Hawes House, each night he would repair to the guest house Wally Harrison had designed for him in the 1930s. As far as I knew, she would later relate, he never slept in the main house with his family. This arrangement was, in fact, nothing new. It had been in force for at least a decade, dating back to the late 1940s. One of Stephen Rockefeller's most vivid childhood memories is of greeting his father in the late afternoon upon his arrival from his New York office. I would take his briefcase and proudly march up the hill with him, the hill leading from Hawes House to the guest house. After he and Mother stopped sharing a bedroom, Stephen recalled, Father stayed up on that hill when in Pocantico. Both husband and wife seemed acclimated to this state of affairs. But now, facing the prospect of a very public campaign with countless family photographs and countless family interviews, Nelson Rockefeller inwardly shuddered. What had been tolerable for so long was quite suddenly intolerable. Now, as he came to grips with the most monumental decision of his career, he suddenly lurched toward another decision. He would seek a divorce from Todd. In the course of a long, meandering car ride, he told Frank Jameson, his PR advisor, of his plans. Jameson was appalled that Rockefeller would consider such a precipitous step on the eve of a major campaign, and made no bones about the consequences. It would be political suicide. Frank felt it would be the end for Nelson politically, his wife Linda would recall. Nelson knew it too, but Frank had to work very, very hard to change his mind. Finally, after much hammering by Jameson, Rockefeller backed off. For the sake of his future in politics, he would maintain the charade of his marriage. Shortly after this was settled, Rockefeller was waiting for his private plane at Westchester County Airport with George Hinman when he spotted a gorgeous red Ferrari. "That's what I really like to have," he said as he ogled the vehicle. "Well," retorted the laconic Hinman, "you can take your choice. You can have the sports car or you can be a governor. You can't do both." For the time being, in the interests of his ambitions, he would keep his impulses in check. But the beckoning sheen of the red Ferrari was never far from Nelson Rockefeller's mind. Thank you. Well, I'll give you a little snippet of life with Nelson and how he positioned himself for the governorship. He won in '58. He beat Averell Harriman. He destroyed him, won by 500,000 votes. And he did it largely through force of personality. His money was a big factor, but more than anything else, it was his political dynamism, the charisma that many people have forgotten about over the years that won him the governorship and positioned him to run for the presidency. He had a tremendous campaigning style. We all remember the Blintz eating. We remember the Rockefeller, and that was part and parcel of his style. There are people who were covering political scene for years who told me that no one was quite like him, except for maybe Bobby Kennedy in 1968, in bringing this level of enthusiasm to politics, having people grab and grapple him. And the Rockefeller we often recount, the old guy, the guy giving the finger to the student demonstrators, the guy groping through his confirmation hearings as vice president, that Rockefeller was there, but much earlier was a much more dynamic figure, someone who many, many people thought could have and should have been president. In fact, Jack Kennedy thought that had Rockefeller run in 1960 against him rather than Nixon, Rockefeller would have been president, not him. And Bobby agreed. As we all know, he ran 3 times. He didn't win any of those times. And yet he was the great figure in New York politics during our time, most of our times. I tell people that when I was 9 years old, he was elected governor, and he was still governor when I entered graduate school. The man dominated this state as no one ever has before or since. And we still have his legacy, both the good legacy in terms of the state university, in terms of the roads, in terms of the Metropolitan Transportation Authority and all the other agencies he started, and the bad legacy in terms of our recoiling from borrowing and from debt and all that, because he did set a standard of profligacy that no governor before and certainly no governor since would ever dare match. Anyway, if there are any questions you all have about Nelson or his life and times or anything, I'd be delighted to answer them.
Are you saying that the Rockefellers spent more money than, say, Cuomo as far as the budget?
Not in terms of the actual dollar, but in terms of the expansion of the state budget from the time he started to the time he left. The percentage expansions were far beyond any percentage expansions since. He built the state budget up not only in the outright budget, but through what came to be known as the moral obligation borrowings, the borrowings through all the authorities and all that. So the actual Nelson Rockefeller indebtedness, I think, was something like $16 billion by the time he left, and when he had entered office, it was like $1 billion. So, you know, in today's terms, it sounds like nothing, but the exponential growth of it in his time was enormous.
Where were these 2 houses that you just mentioned?
In the Picantico?
Yes.
Hawes House and the Guest House. They're both, well, it's hard to describe where they are. They're in the so-called park. Okay, the park is the family. Actually, it's an interesting point. The park is the family's name for the inner estate. Picantico is 3,000 acres. Of that, Some of it's been deeded to the state. Some of it is public. You can kind of ride on horse trails and all that there. But then there is the park. The park is this inner enclave where the Rockefeller family still have homes. And Hawes House, the colonial house that Nelson's family and Todd called home, is in that inner estate, as is Kikett, which is now open to the public and was deeded by Nelson to the National Trust for Historic Preservation. All those homes are, except for Kikett, are private. And there also is the family playhouse, which is still the family playhouse, which is an incredible facility. It's got indoor bowling alleys, it's got indoor tennis courts, outdoor tennis courts, a 9-hole golf course, indoor racquetball courts, billiard tables. I was fortunate enough to get a tour of that, a private tour of that in the spring. Very few non-family members are allowed in the place, and the family's paranoid about anyone coming in. And it was a fascinating place. One of the things that fascinated me was this is a place closed to anyone but the family. And yet you go into the locker room, and there are locks on the lockers. And I was saying, geez, you know, they obviously don't trust each other. They're putting locks in their own lockers. And there's a whole set of rules and regulations, what you can and can't do and all that. So it's very rigidly run, but it is a fabulous place. But again, it is a playhouse. It is a place that has this strange combination of this incredible Rockefeller opulence with these wonderful Beaux-Art mantels and gorgeous furniture, and then, you know, tennis balls being whacked all over the place. And somehow the Rockefellers learned to coexist with this. There also is an outdoor swimming pool that was designed by Wally Harrison, and an indoor pool that was designed by, I believe, by the same people who designed the William Randolph Hearst indoor pool in San Simeon, with potted plants and great Corinthian columns and the whole thing. Again, this is all closed to the public, and the family does not let anyone from the public in.
Did he ever get his Ferrari?
Did he ever get his Ferrari? Actually, I don't know if he ever got the Ferrari. He got a lot of cars. One story I tell in the book is how he coveted a yellow Rolls Royce. The Rolls Royce company, only made one yellow Rolls Royce, and they told him it was not for sale. He could not have it. But he really wanted that car. And so what he did was he hired an intelligence operative from the Royal Air Force to sneak into the Rolls Royce garage, cut a paint chip from the yellow Rolls Royce. Then they brought it back to the States for analysis, determined what the pigments were that made up this color. Nelson bought a gray Rolls Royce, and using those pigments, painted it yellow, so he could have the exact same Rolls Royce that the Rolls Royce company made in a one-time only edition. He had a lot of cars. He would often buy happy cars. He would have his aides, you know, kind of break in the cars for him. You know, he'd buy some kind of Lamborghini and tell his aides, well, drive it around the city a couple of times and break it in for Happy. And so they would drive it around a couple of times and then come back and break it in for Happy. And he had a huge barn full of cars, and he loved driving them. He was a terrible driver. He was the world's worst driver. For the same reason, he was the world's worst sailor. I mean, he couldn't concentrate. He was always looking this way and that way, and people would be cringing every time they were in the car with him. He'd almost hit poles and posts and other cars, and, you know, he'd be talking and gesticulating and not watching. But he had this great faith. I'm Nelson Rockefeller. Nothing can happen to me. And nothing really did, although it almost a couple of times.
Someone said he wasn't elected because the people were afraid of all that wealth.
No, actually, I don't think that was the case. I think one of the problems was he was never nominated, and his wealth was a little off-putting to the Republican Party, to the delegates. But his lack of achieving the presidency was really not due to that, but due more to his inability to get the nomination, his inability to make amends with the right wing of the Republican Party, his inability to avoid making enemies. He was brilliant as a politician in the state scene, yet he was totally maladroit on the national scene. And a lot of it had to do with his, what I call, a strategic blind spot. He could make these wonderful tactical decisions without realizing that they were alienating various people along the way, burning his bridges behind him. So he achieved this wonderful victory in getting this policy through, or getting this particular statement through, or condemning this or that, without realizing this was torpedoing his grander chances. So he had this blind spot, and it did affect him time and time again. There were also a whole other load of factors, a lot of which I'm going to get into in the second volume, regarding his own psychological view of the presidency, his view of himself, his view of his family, and there were just a whole host of reasons. But one reason I do cite in this book is the strategic blind spot he had. which hurt him in terms of getting the nomination. Had he gotten the nomination, there are a lot of people who thought he could have been elected in 1960. In 64, he wouldn't have. I don't think any Republican would have beaten Lyndon Johnson. In 68, had he gotten it, he probably would have beaten Hubert Humphrey. But certainly, he would say later that his closest shot was 1960, and he really blew it in 1960. And had he run in 1960, there's a very good chance that he would have been president, not John F. Kennedy. Any other questions? Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about your access to the family? This was people did talk to you.
Yeah,
right?
they did. They did. They were. I described them as agnostic about this project. They didn't stand in my way, but they didn't go out of their way to open all kinds of doors for me. What happened was when I started the book, I was the only person doing a book on Nelson Rockefeller, and I began writing the letters and doing the interviews. And at some point, Happy Rockefeller said, "Well, I'm not sure this is the proper person for to do my husband's life. I should find a really, my own biographer." So she cast around and she contacted Edmund Morris, who was doing a biography of Ronald Reagan at the time, which he's still working on, the authorized biography of Ronald Reagan, and working on the second volume of his Theodore Roosevelt book. And she approached him, and he was interested because he was sort of alienated from the Reagans at that point. So they talked about it. He went up to Pecantico, looked at the papers, and then he decided he really didn't want to do it. He wanted to stick with the Reagan project. But he told Happy Rockefeller, "I will find you the perfect biographer for your husband." So he began thinking about it, and at some point he heard I was working on it, and he asked to meet with me. I met with him. We spent about an hour and a half talking, at the end of which he said, "I found the perfect Nelson Rockefeller biographer. It's you, and I'm going to tell Happy Rockefeller that." And he did, and just suddenly it was like the ice totally melted, all the gates started opening. I became Nelson Rockefeller's biographer. I met with her. I had extensive interviews with her, with other members of the family. I had extensive access to the family archives. But again, it was that kind of, they finally realized that this guy is probably not so bad after all. Furthermore, he has the level of enthusiasm necessary for this project. And I'll tell you, after 8 years, if you don't have that enthusiasm, there's no way you can do this. I mean, this is an incredible labor. It is a labor of love because the man is incredibly fascinating, and I've never been bored a single day. But it is a big, big labor, and you have to have that level of enthusiasm. But I've had, very good access, and of course there are tons of papers up in Pecantico to look at. A lot of which I still can't look at because they're still sealed, but some of which they are available. So there was a fair degree of cooperation, not on the part of all the family. There were certain family members who still won't talk to me, but certain key family members, there was cooperation.
Who those sealing?
Sorry?
Who sealed them?
Who sealed the papers?
Mm-hmm.
All his papers were sealed upon his death. During his lifetime, he allowed people to burrow through his papers, but after he died, the family became very paranoid, and they closed all his papers. Didn't let anybody see them. And to this day, most of them are still sealed. All his gubernatorial papers, thousands of cubic feet of them are sealed. They won't let anyone see them. They will only open things after someone from the family office has vetted them, gone through the papers. Once they've done that, they open them. So I've seen a lot of papers, and new papers are coming open all the time. But there still is a lot that they won't open up. They won't open it because they don't know what's inside there. And they only know what's inside there when someone literally goes through every box and looks at it. As I point out in the book, you can see Nelson's gubernatorial papers on microfilm, but they are an expurgated version. Someone from Nelson's office, and they were microfilming them, they took the papers out of the boxes, and the secretary went through them and took out the letters and memos that she deemed, quote, troublesome, unquote. This is the secretary deciding this on her own. She left those out. They were not microfilmed. They were returned to the boxes. And so what you see in the microfilm is a fairly good representation of the papers, but it's not complete. The troublesome memos are still lurking in the boxes there, whatever they are. Anyone else?
You're going to say
I was just going to ask, what is the process you used if indeed this happened, where material that you found in a manuscript or archival state on a particular issue or something like that had a very different view from what you learned when you talked to a member
I mean, when
of
if
the
I found
family.
a piece of
Yeah.
paper that contradicted what someone told me,
Yeah, or,
Yeah.
and then maybe a third thing contradicted what had been published in a secondary source.
oh yeah. Well, Nelson would talk about his life all the time, and would have these incredibly, arch, wonderful stories that when you looked at papers were totally untrue. I mean, he'd tell this story about what he did in the Roosevelt administration, and it was poppycock. And you find this all the time with people reminiscing. They often color things, they leave things out, and all that. That's why the documents are so important. But there are other people I have found who had incredibly photographic memories of exactly what happened, and it's borne out by diaries at the time. My best sources were diaries kept by people, or particular notes they kept of things. I mean, those really helped enormously. Nelson himself didn't write long memos about his meetings. He wrote brief memos. He talked about them with aides. But there isn't a lot of Nelson Rockefeller recalls kind of thing. He did an oral history, gave an oral history to Columbia University that is actually going to be opened, I believe, next year. But I've been told don't expect very much. There isn't very much there that he didn't talk about before. And he gave interviews over the years with various people and all that, some of which have been validated, some of which have not. But like many other politicians, there's a tendency to glorify himself, to retell history the way he wants to tell it. So the best recollections Nelson Rockefeller has are recollections right after the fact of having done something, and there are a fair number of those. In the United Nations situation, for instance, when he was the guy who got the United Nations to New York. He brought the United Nations to New York. And that whole saga he told and retold immediately afterward. And so that's a fairly reliable telling. And that was corroborated by other people's telling. Wally Harrison, Bill Zeckendorf, the other principals in the drama. So Nelson Rockefeller's version of how he brought the United Nations to New York is a fairly accurate version. Anything else? Well, I just want to thank you all. I think I've been sort of teasing people about Volume 2 and the fact that all these wonderful mysteries of Nelson's life will be answered in Volume 2, ranging from why he wasn't president to the manner in which he died. And I will fulfill all my promises in Volume 2, but I can tell you that Volume 1 is a fairly good Rosetta Stone in terms of giving you some idea of where the skeletons lie, and some of the answers as to why he did what he did or didn't do what he did. I think you'll find a great deal of the Nelson to come in Part 1, and many of the answers as to why he behaved the way he did in Nelson Part 1. So thank you.